Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We know there are many demands on your time, and everyone has a little bit of webinar fatigue, even here in the new year. So we're delighted to have you all here joining us. We're here to celebrate something, and that is the launch of our new report, Accelerate Aspirations, Moving Together to Achieve Systems Change. My name is Perry Hewitt. I'm the Chief Marketing and Product Officer at Data.org. Data.org is a platform for partnerships focused on building the field of data for social impact. And over the past 8 months to a year, we've been working on this report to analyze the key trends and tensions in the emerging data for social impact sector. First, I'd like to give a big thank you to our co-authors, Daniil Mikhailov, our executive director, Ginger Zielinski, our senior advisor, and Uwe Stewart, our chief data and technology officer. And also to thank the many people who put up with our phone calls in August and September, providing us with insights in terms of their work in the field, as well as literature that we should read and be familiar with as part of putting together this report. Finally, a big thanks to our founding partners, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Rockefeller Foundation, who make all our work possible, and to Splunk for being the leading sponsor on the Accelerate report. So moving on, we're really excited to be here today, not only because the report is live in the world, but because we've already received some terrific feedback on it. My colleague Daniil, Inouye, and myself were privileged to go to Nigeria for about 8 days and then to Davos, Switzerland for about 4 days to introduce some of the early findings of the report and hear feedback both in country and from the philanthropic, private, and public sector people attending Davos in terms of how the report resonated and what issues people were prepared to step up and solve. So at Data.org, we believe that data has the power to create high impact interventions that are affordable and that drive resilience to fight our greatest global challenges. This accelerated report focuses in on that potential and raises questions about what's the purpose and practice of this nascent field and what kind of people is it going to require to keep it all moving. Some of you may be familiar with our earlier Workforce Wanted report that really focused on the talent and capacity building component, but this report took on the sector as a whole. Before we dive into this report, I'd like to think a little bit about why we focused to publish this report in early 23. As a platform for partnerships, we really wanted to be focused on what are those key trends and opportunities, and how do we share them with the sector? How do we align some of the diverse stakeholders in this sector and come together to create a shared plan of action? What are some of the opportunities and some of the obstacles that face us in this field? And then finally, it was a learning mission, right? How do we learn from the diverse voices across geographies, sectors, verticals? This is something we try to do in everything we do, but this report helped us gather these insights systematically. So thanks to everyone who contributed. Today, we'd love to share back with you what we hear from our colleagues across the global field of DSI. And we really like focus on action, right? What are the ways we can provide answers to the question, what are the practical things we can all be doing to accelerate our aspirations and move together to achieve systems change? No one would dispute that funders and private sector and social sector has been focused on this problem and galvanizing resources and insights to solve this problem. We hope that this report will prompt further action and alignment to keep that progress moving forward. Before welcoming our wonderful panelists, I'd like to direct your attention to a brief video.
There's data everywhere.
Data is fundamental to everything that we do.
Data really hold the key to many solutions.
When I think about data science in the social sector, that's the big opportunity.
Across the global south, people are really looking for help just to survive. And we know data can help.
And so it's really critical for us to bring in data scientists or data practitioners who can really help us dig in and understand what does this data actually mean.
So it's a bit like we're sitting on a huge gold mine, but we're unable to mine it.
So that's why we really need to work together to build that data talents and data capacities.
Our mission is to be the field builder, to bring and convene other players, the private industry, the social impact space, the foundations and funders, the governments, the academia, all together in order to have any chance to help social impact organizations use data better.
And data.org is exactly the right organization for that.
Thanks for watching the video. So some of those voices you heard were people we brought together for a convening last fall to really look very hard at the talent piece of this equation. But again, with this new report, Accelerate Aspirations, Moving Together to Achieve Systems Change, we've widened the aperture a little bit to focus on how do we think about building the field as a whole. Now, I'd like to welcome our panelists to the virtual stage. And if each of you could give a brief introduction with your name, organization title, and where you're coming from today. So can we kick it off with you, Aparna, unwitting star of our video?
Very happy to be here. Thank you, Perry. Aparna Krishnan, Project Director from GPAL South Asia, and I'm joining in from Mumbai.
Great, thank you, Bayo.
So excited to join you live from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm Bayo Adekombi, the CEO and founder of DSNAI, also known as Data Science Nigeria or Data Scientist Network. Looking forward to a great time.
Thank you. Chris?
Greetings, everybody. I am Chris Deigelmeyer, and I am the Chief Global Impact Officer at Splunk, and I am joining from the Bay Area and thrilled to be here with these amazing panelists.
And finally, Bilal.
Hi, Perry. An absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Bilal Mateen. I'm the Senior Manager for Digital Technologies at the Wellcome Trust, and I'm dialing in from London.
Terrific. Well, thank you all for being here. And you've all are affiliated with data.org in your own way, whether it's building partners, funding partners, and philanthropic partners. So grateful to you all for your engagement and support as we pull together this report and this event. So in the report, we ended on 3 strong recommendations. And the first was, how do we advance the field of data for social impact by improving our data strategies? That means common governance and tools, better data sharing, aligned incentives, and cross-sector coordination. So I'm going to pick on you first, Bayo. Throughout your career in data and technology, which are big roles in telecoms and in the private sector, you've been a leader across private sector and social sector. What do we mean by aligned incentives? I know that they're hard, but what do we mean by that? And how will that help improve and foster collaboration?
Thank you very much for that. I think the first dominant truth here is the fact that everything starts and ends with high quality data when it comes to data for social impact. And of course, the report has shown that. The video we have seen today has shown that as well. But a sustainable data access and utilization model within the data for social impact space must recognize the importance of aligned incentive for it to optimally serve the varied interest of the stakeholders. First, I think I might need to define the concept of aligned incentive. If I can use the term within the investment world, an analogy, aligned incentive is defined as a concept where a firm and its partners are mutually rewarded for working to build successful and sustainable companies. So emphasis here is collaboration, mutual benefit, and shared value creation. So we can see from here that if we really want to get the data owners to be part of data for good ecosystem, we must answer the fundamental question of what is in need for them, especially because we know that the largest chunk of the data set that we really need for social good are actually in the private sector. So we cannot pretend that we're not aware of the concern or the fact that it takes a lot for private sector to have invested in building this data set. I always say that it is hard hand, it is competitive asset, and so therefore it is not just copy and paste. There's so many costs, either conversion costs, cloud costs, security costs. And for that reason, it is important that there must be something on the table between the private public sector to find that intersection in terms of how do we share data for social good. To make this more contextual, at DSN, we always talk about the fact that there are 3 A's of data, 3 A's. The first A is that data must be accessible. To make data accessible in the format that is usable in the last mile, this is very expensive. So even if I make it available to you, the accessibility requires customizing the data in the format that can be used in the last mile. The second thing is that data must be adaptable, which means that it must be enriched, enhanced to serve what is needed to be done within the use case of social goods. So for example, if I have call data record from a telecoms operator, I have to convert it into adapt it so that I can use the mobility format to understand disease pattern, or perhaps use things like mobile money transaction to understand financial inclusion, social welfare, and all that. So essentially, the fundamental pillars of data requires some investment, for which an incentive must be provided to make this really meaningful to data owners. I'll call it return on data sharing, to the extent that there must be something at stake. For example, if you look at the kind of data we're talking about anonymized and de-identified sensor data, mobility data, satellite imagery data, wearable data, commercial camera data. These are several zettabytes of data which are housed in mega storehouses that requires a lot of investment to maintain, to manage them. And therefore, there must be a form of data collaborative model, where there is an incentive to corporations to make this anonymized data available for social impact, so that the whole concept of RODS means return on data sharing, is guaranteed. This may be in form of tax incentives or any other thing. I think for me, having been in private sector and in being in social goods sector, is the fact that we cannot be so emotional about this. Sometimes I see a lot of sensational, emotional blackmail. Oh, we have to share our data. We have to do that. But data is a big deal. It is a big thing. And for that reason, it is a critical factor of production, is a competitive asset. And therefore, there must be a form of shared benefit model within the data for impact ecosystem so that we can make it sustainable. Another critical element of aligned incentive, which I would like to speak to, is the concept of data trust, a form of stewardship and trusteeship where data user, data owner, and data governors come together, to manage shared data asset for public good. This has been a conversation by policymakers in recent times. So in this construct, we see data institutions, whether private sector, public sector, they come together to support, social good by pooling their data asset or data resources together. And they have independent trusteeship model where these assets are managed. The cost is shared among the trust members, but the fundamental driver is that the usage is well defined within, is defined for social benefit of society's interest. And with that, we can unlock data-enabled innovations and make data, amplify data for social good. But of course, this kind of model requires a lot of work to work in real world. And that thing is what I call aligned incentive model, where all the stakeholders who are bringing what they have worked on for many years onto the table. So this aligned model must bring diverse partners together, various actors. It must be on a long-term basis, not a short-term. It must be multi-sectoral because we need different types of data set, telco data for mobile operators. We need financial transaction data, diverse data, logistics data, and all that. And it must be well-resourced so that we're able to create the desired big bang social impact. So aligned incentives mean you must answer the question of what is the need for the data owner so that they find a form of meaning to making what they have built over time available for social good.
Thank you so much, and completely aligned with what we heard globally, the alignment of incentives and then what's in it. This is hard-earned data. I love that expression. People have invested, companies invested huge amounts in order to produce this data. So there has to be something in it for them. But I'd like to probe a little bit about this alignment in a low and middle income context. Given our recent time together in Nigeria, one of the things that struck me is the growth opportunity there, right? In a growing country with a huge youth population, the data would seem to be even more valuable in some contexts. Is there something different about alignment needs in low and middle income countries that stands out to you?
Yes, and I'll tell you, data is actually more critical in low income countries than any other context. Why? Because there are no alternatives. There are no alternatives. It is critical to drive virtually every single economic value creation entity. Whether you talk about health, you talk about general productivity, you talk about financial inclusion, you talk about agriculture. And this has become more critical in a context where there's low resources, there's capacity constraints, and there are infrastructural gaps. But when you productize data into sequence of instructions, it has capacity to replace a lot of things. As simple as, conversational data. If I speak to a lot of doctors, I collect all the data set, put it in something that is similar to ChatGPT, we can create a new doctor, virtual doctor, who can support people in local community and speak in their local languages. These are very, very critical. And this, of course, has immediate consequence on reducing infant mortality, improving productivity, enhancing quality of life. So in low, medium income country, this is non-negotiable. And that is why the need for an aligned incentive as well detailed in the report as a must-have is critical to make impact, is critical for social development, is critical for driving and turning around the whole economic story of Global South.
And in areas where the government has so much invested in the advancement of the nation, right? Where they're so, the Ministry of Science and Technology in Nigeria is so invested in innovation in the sector. So they have a lot of skin in the game to create those incentives. So thank you for that. First, before I go on, I want to remind everyone in the audience, please put your questions into the chat. As you can see, we have tremendous panelists with a lot of great expertise to share. So please add them now, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So I'm going to move on to Aparna Krishnan. The second recommendation in our accelerator report is, as we discussed in, Italy in the fall, it's how do we build a more diverse and interdisciplinary workforce of purpose-driven data practitioners, and those data practitioners who can create and drive change locally. These are not solutions we want flown in from New York or San Francisco. This is putting people locally in the driver's seat with data capabilities in order to drive data for social impact. So in your role at JPAL, you work across national government partners, tech and domain experts, researchers, philanthropy, to set up data use cases across sectors. And we're all in alignment here. We need people with data expertise in local context to work on projects. So how do you think, based on our conversations the last fall, new insights from the report, and your own experience, how can we develop purpose-driven data talent needed to tackle these challenges that are interconnected, like climate and health, which is something we're working on in India? What have you seen been effective, and where could such an effort go wrong?
Right, those are great questions, Perry. These are some of the questions we've been working on a lot when we think of research use of data and how that could be used for social goods. So with climate challenges, especially as we think about global challenges, what becomes increasingly important is the interconnectedness that you mentioned. And there are two levels of interconnectedness that I'd like to think about, and I'll give you a couple of examples as well. One is combining what we call a globally informed and a locally grounded approach to solutioning, which means you need the knowledge, methods, data that can be compiled across different contexts, different regions, and develop solutions that are locally relevant and that are using local knowledge and expertise. So one of the projects that we are engaged in along with data.org is the Capacity Accelerator Network, which aims to do exactly this, is to train local talent so that you can combine lived experiences of people in these regions with the methodology, skills, and data that is required, or data science skills required to address local policy and development challenges. And this, I think, is even more evident in dealing with climate challenges, where the interconnectedness is more and more evident. We know, for example, the impact of floods, not just on economic losses, but also on health, physical and mental health, as well as other socioeconomic considerations of communities, especially in living in vulnerable, marginalized regions in flood-prone countries. So we have researchers, for instance, who've looked at how we could use satellite data and advances in technology to improve early warning systems of floods. And as the accelerator report points out, there's tremendous potential of using data to address some of these challenges. But what becomes increasingly important is how are these challenges applied for the social good? And this is where the local context comes in, and it becomes really important. Is one thing is to have the early warning system, but how does it actually disseminate in communities that have largely relied on personal networks, in-person information, or village leaders to tell them on what to do and how to act? So there's a lot of work that goes into say, how do we use existing networks? What should go into such messaging which then enables communities to act to the information that is provided. And we have enough research that shows that people do respond to some of these solutions. Another area where I think the interconnectedness or intersectoral approach becomes important is, again, in designing solutions to problems that may emerge from one sector but have implications on multiple sectors. And what do I mean by this? So for instance, in certain parts of India, in 1 or 2 states, farmers adopt a process of burning crop residue. And this causes air pollution, not just in the region where the crops are burned, but more so in regions downstream. So which means large parts of northern India are dealing with severe air pollution during winter months, which then, as you know, has implications on life expectancy and morbidity. Now, the government has had policy responses which ban such crop residue burning. They subsidize equipment that can be used to clear residue. But the solution may actually lie elsewhere. So more recently, researchers associated with us are looking at how could we use this data using satellite images to see where the crop burning occurs, at what level, and actually think of the solutions from a behavioral economics perspective. Is because there are incentives of the local administrators in implementing penalties. There are incentives of farmers to protect the environment, and how could we move those things? And interestingly, there was a solution using conditional cash transfers, and the idea that came was to actually make an upfront payment, which was unconditional, which did 2 things. It improved the trust of farmers that they would actually get compensated or paid for taking a certain action, and it also helped with liquidity. So you can see that for some of these questions, you need people to come together, and this happens as we've seen in a lot of the work that we do, is when we have domain experts combined with local practitioners, researchers, methodology, and data science experts. And so that's when we understand challenges better, and we come up with solutions that are actually addressing some of these challenges. Now, all of this sounds great, but like you rightly said, the challenges remain, and I think Bayo talked about that. It's not easy to do, and it's costly to do. And so there's a lot of investment and effort that goes in collecting data that can speak to each other to enable some of these intersectoral challenges. And I can talk about that further as we think through how to address some of these challenges.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And I love that you touched on trust as well as Bayo did, because nothing can move forward without trust is a finding we had tremendously in our Recode report last year. One thing I'd like to probe a little bit more on is how do you get the local practitioners to the table? You mentioned the upfront incentives to the farmers, but as we think about, Data.org has set this goal by 2032, 1 million purpose-driven data practitioners. What are the ways you can bring people to the table to work on these interconnected issues?
Exactly. So I think shared incentives and aligned incentives, which we talked about earlier, it becomes important. One of the fundamental things I've always said is to think about use of data from the end purpose. What is the problem that we're trying to address? What is the solution we're trying to develop? And then look for the data that can address those questions. So there's a little bit of a challenge here. It's because when we think about intersectionality, how could mobility data from Facebook become useful? Or how could cell phone records become useful? And you often don't know what you're solving for. So it's important to align, I would say, the approach and align objectives to social good. So start from the use case, start from the biggest policy challenges or development challenges we're trying to deal with. And that actually becomes the shared platform, whether it is a policymaker, whether it's an NGO practitioner, a technology company, or a researcher, we're all solving a problem. And when you start from that, then what data do we collect? How can this data speak to other forms of data? What is the solution for it? How do we implement the solution? And a nice way to actually test this out is with evaluations and research, because that gives us a platform to design and pilot a few ideas. Some things work, some things will not work, but then we learn from it. That process of iteration, improvement, then helps us come up with solutions that everybody has a buy-in into. You've co-developed or co-created a solution, which is then also tested to know why certain things work and whether they can actually be replicable at scale.
Thank you. That's the locally grounded piece we're all looking for. How do we make sure that the problems feel clear and actionable to get people to engage in it versus, some global, effort that you're contributing to, but doesn't sort of change your day to day. So thank you so much for that. So finally, I'm going to turn to you, Bilal Mateen. Our third recommendation talks about creator stronger funding models with longer time horizons, more flexible structures, and better coordination. So I'll translate that to fewer shiny apps, more people talking to each other, which I think you'd be a great candidate to champion. So with your portfolio as a funder, you work with academia and social impact teams to create digital public goods, right? Things we can all, contribute to and benefit from, creating collaborative, interoperable, and open systems to prevent these one-off and siloed projects. So how do you think about funding this work differently? On a panel last week in Switzerland, we heard, some funders talking about, agile internal teams shaping the way they work. What kind of capabilities do you have to have in-house now? Or what kind of mindsets do you have to have in-house now? And what lessons can you share with our funder audience? Thanks, Bilal.
So it's a brilliant question, Perry. And I think that if I'm going to be honest, I'd love to say that we have some profoundly different playbook by which we fund digital public goods for science and health research and just more broadly. But if I'm very honest with you, I don't, at least not yet. I think it's a process of continual learning, and there's been some hard-won lessons that have resulted in some step changes in our behavior at Wellcome, I think the funding community at large. And that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few reflections on what some of those step changes have been, and hopefully you'll realize that they're not profound, but they've had quite a substantial impact on the value of our work. And it starts with doing your homework, being intentional about landscaping what the field looks like, what's already been done, how we don't duplicate. And I think that speaks to our ambition of wanting to be more than just a checkbook as a funder. We want to be a valuable partner that co-develops this work, that has something useful to contribute to the end goal and the ambition. But more importantly, I think we're all a little bit guilty of having built the same thing multiple times and given groups money to build very similar things without realizing it. There's one example that got used very often when I first joined, where we'd given a grant to build the exact same thing 3 times before someone else realized. And it wasn't even one of the funding teams. It was someone in our enterprise digital technology team who had seen the same grant come through the system. So I think we're all guilty of it. And to make sure we're using our capital judiciously, there's this need to do our homework up front. And I don't think that's unique to tech funding, but rather funding as a whole. But it's been critical to making us more effective in how we leverage the dollars that we have. I think in terms of capabilities, I love the agile argument. I will simplify it even further. We've done this with science research for decades. We had folks with PhDs in neuroscience looking after our neuroscience portfolio. We have people with lived experience of mental health conditions involved in our mental health funding. Why do we not have a cohort of tech generalists that are sat at that table helping us fund digital public goods? Some funders moving in that direction. I don't think we're seeing it across the board, and I'd love to see it more. Because if you're going to set reasonable expectations with your grantees, if you're going to be able to go back to senior leadership and say, you know what, it does actually cost this much to build this thing, you need to have seen what a software research engineer gets paid. You need to have written a line of code to understand the complexities of that process. And thus, I really think we need those generalists in the room. And the beauty of this is those people need to come from somewhere. And there's this neat little virtuous cycle you create by investing in capacity strengthening, right? It's the unintended benefit of minting the next generation of professional philanthropists that help drive the innovative funding. I came from somewhere. I have a data science background. I'm a clinician. I never thought I would go into funding and philanthropy in this space. But because the opportunities existed, when the job presented itself, I could, right? So I think there's the unintended benefit of us just trying to help strengthen the ecosystem as a whole. And then there's just recognizing and centering the differences between tech and hypothesis-driven research, right? When you have a wet lab experiment, you can pay for it. You don't really need to think about the maintenance of that experiment for the next 40, 50 years. It's just fundamentally different, right? Results are done, they're published. There's the ongoing issue of archiving of the data, but with foundational tech and training, you literally have to pay for someone to maintain that. And we don't have good models of sustainability in the DPG landscape, right? We've got a handful of tools. Some of them have reached cost neutrality. Each looks a little bit different, and we don't know what's reproducible. And I think it comes back to this, the real mindset shift is just getting comfortable with the fact that there's uncertainty, there's a risk of failure, and we've got to be willing to pay for that experimentation. For some reason, we're very okay with it when it's hypothesis-driven research, right? If the research fails to give you the answer you're looking for, that's okay. There are a couple caveats I'll add, but I think we need to get a lot more comfortable with paying for big tech projects, recognizing there's a risk there. It may not work, but it's worth the risk.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I'm reminded of the XKCD cartoon with everything depending on one single line of code. And I think a lot of our projects suffer from that, how do we maintain that core infrastructure and think about it? And having spent a little bit of time on your side of the table, one of the things that does strike me is that need for tech generalists of how do you think about maybe a dashboard for cities isn't structurally code-wise that different than a dashboard for climate change or a dashboard for, public health. But when the teams are siloed, it's hard to bridge that gap. So thanks for the hard work you're doing to bring that not only across different philanthropies, but also within large philanthropies themselves. I know it can be challenging. Before I come to you, Chris, I'd like to remind the audience that we are taking questions and Q&A after this. So please put your questions into the chat. So Chris, first of all, thank you again for sponsoring this report. It was a labor of love for myself and our co-authors. And you know this, I know in the important work you do that we have a data divide between the private and public sector. It's what private and social sector. And that's why data.org was founded at Davos in 2020. That's why MasterCard and Rockefeller came together and said, gosh, there's a big delta here and we want to use data smarter for the social sector. Our research for the report, our findings from our data maturity assessment highlight this gap. And we've covered some of these risks and challenges in the Accelerate report. But where do you see systemic change going? How do you see effective collaboration between the private and social sectors headed? Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists for the great insights. And it's just, I feel, inspired that we're starting to see more progress even in this last year. What I would say in terms of the system side, in addition to all the pieces of the report that are important, is we really need to focus on this large data ecosystem. And that's what is really kind of missing. We know the talent side at the organizational level, but really building an ecosystem for social impact that is at this big data scale, that's not these one-off projects, I think is what we need to tackle first. And I'd say there are two things that we need to do right away to move this from idea to action. One is we need to change the narrative. And I would say every meeting anybody goes into needs to start with data is power. And we need to ask ourselves, why are we not advocating for investing in power for societal benefit? And if we continue to think about quote unquote data and talent as overhead, we are sunk for the 21st century. Like it is at this moment of urgency. And I want to give it's such a crystal clear example right now of if we don't move up that needle, what is at stake? Let's remember OpenAI, which just released ChatGPT that everybody's been using. It was founded as a nonprofit. They wanted it for societal benefit. And they went out to governments, they went out to philanthropy, trying to get it funded at scale to deliver at its potential, and they were unsuccessful. Transitioned to a for-profit with $1 billion invested by Microsoft. And what a loss for social impact, because we were not able to see the big picture and to build that ecosystem. And if you look, like Gates is giving away $8.3 billion next year. You've got these big, step up and let's put our big girl pants on and invest these $200 million, $100 million. Because could you imagine right now if ChatGPT was designed for social impact, it was sitting in a place of power of nonprofits to drive collaborations, from corporations, would look fundamentally different than it is now, that is getting future investment from the corporate sector. And again, I believe the nonprofit sector will benefit, but not nearly at the scale that's potential. So if we change the narrative to reach that scale, that's what we need to do, because sometimes it's incremental change, and in this new data AI enabled world, sometimes it's leapfrog change and transformation. And we need to be at that much bigger scale to do that change. Then when it comes to the collaboration front, a number of the folks have, touched on this. I would say we need to get comfortable with progress over perfection. And let's acknowledge the nonprofit sector, the government sector, the corporate sector. We all operate in a different structure with different pressures and different norms. And so when we get together, we need to give that grace and meet in the middle. And so, especially in this data world, there's people just dig their heels in. They're like, no data everywhere, it's terrible. And then there's like data for everything. And therefore, if we can come to the table and figure out and bring grace to acknowledge, yeah, corporates, we're under pressure for quarterly profits right now. Like, it is about operational efficiency. We want to do good, but this is certain pressure we have. We also then need to, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, social enterprise, academia, philanthropy, and corporate. So I've had that lived experience of being in those environments, and therefore feel deeply that we can overcome those differences if we just acknowledge them and not try to change them, because we're not going to change the system and structures right now. So those would be my two things to drive and build this ecosystem: is change the narrative. We need to know data is power, and let's act like it, and then move from perfection to progress.
Thank you so much. I definitely am getting great is the enemy of good vibes of the perfect world of data. I think data was, in the 90s, there was just so much promise it's going to solve absolutely everything. Yeah. And then realizing that it requires, messy human things like governance and trust. And as you said, a little bit of grace to understand other people's perspectives. And I love Bio's point about, this is hard-earned data, right? People have invested a lot in it, and absolutely people want to galvanize and build the social sector, but they are accountable too to their shareholders and their bosses. So how do you strike that balance in a thoughtful way? So I'm going to ask everybody to come back to the stage to take a few of our audience questions, if you will. So I will start by picking on Bio, if I may. Someone has asked, what is the definition of a data practitioner? And let's make it harder for you and say a purpose-driven data practitioner. What does that look like to you, Bio?
Okay, thank you. I think I would define, first and foremost, a data practitioner first. So it's someone who supports what we call data lifecycle. And the data lifecycle is collecting data, transforming data, analyzing data, communicating data, and the bigger one, productizing data to inform, guide, impact, and decision. Now, if I take that to purpose-driven data practitioner, is within the same domain. Is someone who has what I call domain expertise, combining with hands-on technical skill, and has a social impact mindset, in terms of how data can improve the quality of life of people. So that consciousness informs the process of how data is collected, a lot of empathy, a lot of connection, a lot of on-ground reality. How data is transformed and analyzed with due respect for ethics, due respect for data responsibility and fairness, and how data is productized intentionally to solve social issues, especially by addressing infrastructural gaps, whether in medical area, whether in agriculture, whether in financial inclusion, that at the end of the day, there is an intentional uplift in the quality of lives of people. I think that is how I would try to define a data-driven, a purpose-driven data practitioner.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we wrestled a lot with that language, but that's where we ended. And a big finding from our first few years in operations has really been that it is all along the continuum, right? Everyone from enumerator to data entry to, a data scientist, and all hands are needed in this important work, but context really matters. Social context, local context are what differentiates the purpose-driven. So secondly, moving from globally informed to locally led relevant solutions is key for sustainability. How are we doing on that? And what practical steps can we do to make sure it's happening? So Aparna, that's some of your language. I wonder if you wouldn't mind tackling that one.
Right. So some of it I touched upon when I was talking about how to co-create solutions locally. The other part, I think, on the training of data science professionals or creating purpose-driven data science practitioners. some of it has to start in the way we do our training. And in a lot of the low-income settings, we have training in engineering, we have training in social sciences. But what we really need is to bring in multiple aspects into the training itself. So we are able to build in an understanding of social impact challenges into different disciplines, and then actually combine some of that training with practical experience, whether it's through apprenticeships or projects or fellowships, which is what we're attempting to do, which then gives a platform for people to apply what they're learning. So that's on when we're creating new talent going forward. And we see some of those efforts happening now is to build on that and see how we can create an interdisciplinary pool of data science professionals. And as we were just joking about it, I think as we have purpose-driven data science or data practitioners, we also need data-driven policymakers and practitioners. So some of this culture change in thinking about how to use data beyond reporting or beyond the operational transactional purpose for which it's being collected or generated, to starting to think about data as power or data as a tool for informing decisions. That is the difficult part. That is, you'll have to work within political constraints, financial constraints, incentives, biases, but that's the slow, long road of creating that environment. And some of it, I think, really starts from using as much data that's available locally to understand the problem that we're trying to address, rather than just directly try to take a solution that has worked elsewhere in the world and try to apply it locally immediately. Is to first unpack the problem, unpack how different communities are affected by it, how gender plays into the problem, and how women, for instance, are affected differently from a problem compared to men, or poorer communities, or by caste or subgroups. And that comes with both existing data as well as surveys or local data that we collect. And then that should then lead to a co-creation of solutions, which is what I was talking about, is to then try and see how we can combine different disciplines to find locally relevant solutions. So it's a long question, but I hopefully touched on a few aspects that are needed.
Thank you so much. No, I keep hearing the call for flexible, ambidextrous professionals, right? You'd be able to see things from both. And in the US, you are starting to see that in traditional higher ed, right? How you have people focused more on, STEAM versus STEM, on CS plus. What are some of the ways we can combine computer science or traditional machine learning with other domains and see huge value in that. So I know we've talked a lot about COVID and the role of COVID in changing our attitudes toward data. Certainly, as we began to launch our Epiverse program, that was one of the things we thought a lot about. Is you had all this terrific data, but maybe it was captured with different, different attributes in mind. It was stored in different places. It didn't all talk to one another. So Bilal, have we seen improvements since COVID-19? Have we improved any of the data systems and architecture, including the ways governments understand and use it? Have we done that globally? Have we done that in LMICs? Where do you see progress and where do you see continued problems?
Oh, interesting question. So I think that we've definitely seen progress, but I think that comes with a caveat that we haven't seen progress equitably. We've seen a fair rush to build things in the midst of a pandemic because we needed answers. And my concern is that there was a wave of funding that came with the pandemic that is slowly withdrawing, if not rapidly, in some parts of the world. For example, in the UK, we've seen a massive reduction in funding for our core sample registration systems that gave us an idea of what the prevalence and incidence of COVID was every week, that was run by our National Statistics Institute. And what that means is all the infrastructure that was built is not being maintained, is going to fall off a cliff, and we're going to have created a lot of abandonware. I think that was also our ambition behind something like Epiverse, right? We've built this community of practice. Can we convene them and help direct them? Because epidemics and pandemics are only going to become more frequent as a consequence of climate change. So there's a need for this kind of investment to prepare ourselves for the future. So I'm cautiously optimistic that there's a lot that can be done. We learned a lot from COVID. We saw what can happen when people are motivated. Equally, I think we need to be very careful about shoring up the investments that worked. And buried within that is an idea that, or the assumption that we know what worked. And I don't think we do in every circumstance. And there's an opportunity now that we can invest in evaluations and retrospective exercises that give us an idea of where there's an opportunity to double down on funding, where there's an opportunity to sunset something that may have felt like a good idea, but we realized and we can learn a lesson that maybe it wasn't the most effective thing in the world. So a circuitous answer to the, I think COVID changed a lot. It really did demonstrate the art of the possible, especially in DPG development for social impact. But I think there are a lot of lessons and there is a caution that's necessary as we progress, that not everything worked brilliantly, and that sharing data without license and without engagement may have been necessary for a short period of time during a pandemic, but is not necessarily the best thing to do if we're going to be driven by this idea that our actions need to be underpinned by trust and trustworthiness, as Bayo and Aparna have mentioned several times.
I love that term, abandonware. That's a terrific one, because that is exactly what happens, right? You get all this momentum, excitement, and you build the software, and then it's gone. So Chris, I know there was a huge private sector effort around the time of COVID to like, how do we provide data? How do we provide insights? What of that has, sort of to Bilal's point, what of that has endured, whether that's mindset or projects? And what if that has sort of gone by the wayside? And how do we think about doing sustainable private sector engagement? Again, I go back to Bayo's great 3 A's. I think it was available, accessible, adaptable. Maybe it's anonymized as well. What are the ways the private sector can continue to think about how we can be part of that data ecosystem for good in situations like pandemics in a way that, maintains your business goals?
Yeah. So I just want to add on to kind of that point of all these things were built. And what is missing in the social impact sector is who is going to sustain. And Bayo mentioned, everybody has mentioned this. It's expensive to maintain data. And you add on that how fast it's growing. There's a reason that the corporate, whether it's the Amazons of the world and so forth, are just, the power that they have because they're holding on to that data and mining it and using it. So what I would say is governments and the nonprofit sector need to figure out what is a data ecosystem going to look like. Is a data platform. I know I'm not going to use the term refineries, but they play a role in kind of the corporate sector and have a lot of downside around ethics in those pieces. But if we could build these ongoing data platforms that are held over time for public benefit, that's what's going to need, because the corporate sector isn't going to lead holding that type of work over the long term. Where they come in from a value proposition standpoint is, here's a need, where's your data, where can it go? But then it's going to be either government or the nonprofit sector that are going to need to build these long-term data ecosystem, ongoing data platforms, so that everything doesn't become, in the social impact sector, a project that has a start and an end. So I just want to kind of own the truth that if we're looking to the private sector to be owning the data platforms for good, I don't think we're going to get the outcomes that we need. And we're going to need to push in these other entities that are designed for public benefit and invite the corporate sector in when they're needed with the right data and the right talent, and be able to get that long-term view around what a big data ecosystem can look like.
Completely agree. Thank you so much. And we've gotten a terrific and very timely question of how can the social sector take advantage of what is a very difficult moment in the private sector, where the tech sector, having staffed up through the pandemic and need to develop capabilities, and is now having to shed some jobs. So I don't know, Bayo or Aparna, you want to take that of like, are there people who, when we did the Workforce Wanted report, we talked about 4 ways to get these purpose-driven data practitioners. One was, how do we get new talent? How do we, upskill existing social sector talent with data skills? How do we get transitional talent? And how do we get leadership on board with the importance of this? So I guess this is section 3, like the transitional talent. There may be people who've worked, had terrific careers in the private sector and have an opportunity to think about other roles. So Bayo, do you want to take a shot at what are some of the ways we can make the case of the value of the social sector at this moment in time?
I strongly believe that, referring back to the report, this is a time to support a lot of people to transition for impact. This is the time to do that. And I tell you, they've got the technical skill. We just need to provide the context that can allow them to support social good. And I do believe that even prior to now, and I can say that, I'm aware of several data science professionals who are already gifting their time to support social good. There were quite a lot of initiatives like that, like DataKind and so many. For us at Data Science Nigeria, we had volunteers who are professionals who are gifting their time. So it is now time what they were gifting to now focus more on it. And so the responsibility is now on us in the social space to attract them, give them the right proposition. And in this case, it may not just be, the proposition may not necessarily be the financial, it may also be something that is meaningful to them, purpose-driven, that sense of purpose to attract them, excite them, and do a lot of impactful research. But one thing I also need to note here is the fact that the concept of social impact is not that it's not going to be profitable. It can still be profitable. So if we attract them, they build impactful solutions, then they can take a fair share of what they built. And this is the best time to attract them, to come build, and whatever comes out of that, in terms of monetary return, the whole concept of aligned incentive will work so that they can take a fair share of that, and that can compensate for whatever they will have done in any of the global companies. That is my own thoughts. Thanks. Over.
Thank you. No, I think particularly in developing context, there's so much opportunity for that social enterprise angle on solving these important problems. So that's a great way to consider it. I'm going to ask each of you to come up with one concrete action the audience can take after this webinar to accelerate action. I'll start first. Of course, the easy answer is download the report, but I think a more nuanced answer might be, how do we think about opportunities for alignment across sectors? So concretely, if you are in the social sector and you're looking for private sector data to fuel your information, if you are in a philanthropy and you are looking to work with a social impact organization, can we start our projects more concretely to be alignment and use case first versus your desired end in order to guarantee success? So that's my concrete action. I'll punt it over to Chris.
Yeah, so I would make the case that we need everybody to be data literate, just like everybody needs to be financially literate. So this isn't just the data scientist coming into the organization, whether you work in development, you're the CEO, you're the marketing person. We all as a society need to be data literate to own that piece and have that power. We wouldn't send our kids off to be adults without being financial literate these days, right? You just wouldn't do it. They would not be successful. And that is going to be the new case for data going forward. So that would be my recommendation, is everybody start to become data literate, and then we'll be able to make progress for societal benefit.
Thank you, Chris. More data literate world. All right, Aparna, what's your concrete action?
I would say everybody create a data strategy that's anchored in how the data is going to be used for public good to whatever extent the organization is able to contribute, and think about these intersectionalities. Where else would that data be useful, and what other data would be useful for your work, is to start thinking about that more proactively and systematically.
Great. So begin with the end in mind. Bilal?
I'm going to echo something that I think the report does a brilliant job at explicitly calling out, which is the need for better coordination amongst funders. Individually, it would take us decades to make all the necessary experimental grants and see the outcomes to figure out how to do digital development, digital strategy support and funding in the social impact space. If we started sharing the wisdom from our back catalogs, we could probably get there in a year or two. And so the useful thing that each and every funder, for those of you that are on the call, could do is first send an email internally to figure out what your strategy is, get aligned on that, and then send an email to your fellow funding partners and colleagues and see if you can all get on the same page. I'm hoping my email is very easily discoverable online. If not, Perry, I'm sure we'll give it to anyone that asks. So yeah, thanks, Perry. Yep. And I think that's the useful thing and the concrete action that folks could take after this call.
I love the term you used just now, back catalog, right? We all have so much that we've learned, whether, particularly in the large philanthropies where so much terrific work has been done, but it's hard to transfer it. It's hard to transfer it across departments. It's hard to transfer across domains, and certainly across philanthropic institutions who all, with the best and most laudable goals, are looking to make change. And I love that some of you brought up, that the accelerating, demand to disperse this money. So in order to get the funds to the right people, we would so benefit from the wisdom of the back catalog. All right, we'll close with you, Bio. What is your one concrete action you want people to take?
My action will actually focus on data users within the social impact or social good space. It is time to become business literate, building from what Chris said. This is business literate. The data owners are business leaders. They want us to come to the table, not just asking for their data, but also showing them how the data they sit on can help them make more money, so that these all aligned incentives become meaningful. We must come to the table, not just as I need your data, but I can also contribute. In traditional business model, the way it works is that traditional business has what they call CSR, corporate social responsibility, where they do something for good. So I'm challenging a nonprofit social good organization to start having what I call business responsibility unit that is responsible to partnering with business who have got data, in accessing their data to also help them to use the data to drive incremental value. And hence, the whole shared value creation, aligned incentive is activated, and this become more sustainable. Thanks.
Great. So building that business responsibility unit right into the work that you do in order to make it more sustainable. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Chris Steigelmeier of Splunk, sponsors of this report, Bayoda Kanbe, the CEO of Data Scientists Network, Apana Krishnan of JPAL, and Bilal Mateen of Welcome. Thank you all so much for your insights, not only in contributing to this report, because I know we tapped all your brains as well, but for your time today with our audience. I'd like to encourage everyone to download the report, not only as my concrete action, and to also join us for our next webinar, where we'll be talking about how do we get that data-driven leadership in the social sector. That'll be on February 7th, coming right up. Thank you all for your time today, and thanks everyone for attending. Have a wonderful day.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.